Oh, but you might say, at the end, there must be something that stops that chain of dependence, which in itself isn't dependent on anything else before it. Well, then you have basically concluded that there is a necessary existent and the argument is done. But Ibn Sina isn't this lazy. Let's instead presume that all existence that we can know are indeed contingent. But perhaps we can consider that the whole chain, or the whole set of all contingent things, all things in the universe taken together as a whole, that whole maybe is necessary. Right? Everything we can know in the universe seems to be contingent because everything is dependent on something, caused by something else. But that's unsatisfactory because then why are there things at all? If everything is dependent on something else, where is the sort of source of these things? What is the first cause, as Aristotle would call it? Because no matter how far we push the argument, we always end up with more contingents and never reach a cause that stands on its own, sort of independently, that started the chain. So again, let's then presume that perhaps the totality of all contingent things, this whole set taken together, is necessary, while all the individual constituents of that whole are the contingent things, but that the whole itself is somehow necessary. This argument does not hold to Ibn Sina. Why? Because what is a totality? It is a collection or amalgamation of parts. But if that whole is dependent on parts to make it what it is, it's no longer necessary. It too is contingent because it is dependent on its contingent parts and has been caused by them. Quote, if that other, so one of the existence in this chain of contingent existence, goes on to infinity, every one of the units of the chain will be possible in essence. But the whole chain depends on these units. Thus the chain too will not be necessary and becomes necessary through another. He further explicates on this point in the Isharat, quote, every totality having every one of its units as cause requires a cause external to its units. This is because either 1. It does not require a cause at all, hence it is necessary and not possible, but how could this be so when it is only necessitated by its units? 2. It requires a cause that is all its units, hence it is caused by itself. That totality and all its units are one thing. Further, kull in the sense of every one is not something through which the totality is necessitated. 3. It requires a cause that is some of its units. But if every one of its units is caused, then some of its units are not more deserving of being the cause than some others. The reason is that the cause of the caused is more deserving of being the cause. Or, number 4, it requires a cause external to all units. That is the remaining truth. He's giving us 4 options here. The first we've already covered to some degree. Maybe the whole set or chain taken as a whole doesn't need a cause. Well, we've already shown that it is caused because it is dependent on its constituent parts. As Ibn Sina said, it is, quote, necessitated by its units. The second option is that perhaps all of the individual units are the cause of the whole set. But this obviously doesn't make sense because all the units are contingent, so they can't cause themselves and therefore not the whole either. Thirdly, maybe one unit in the chain is the cause. But this is clearly not the case either because, again, each unit is contingent. Even if you would say that one of the units isn't contingent but necessary, then that unit wouldn't be part of the set anymore because the set was a set of contingent things. So it would be outside the set and again our problems would be solved. So this doesn't really solve the issue either. We're only left with the 4 option then to Ibn Sina. That is, that the whole set of contingent things, the whole universe with all its existence, must require a cause that is external to all its units. Quote, every totality organized of causes and effects consecutively, including a non-caused cause, has this uncaused cause as an extremity, for if the cause were an intermediate, it would be caused. So we have reached a kind of inevitable conclusion based on the logical experiment that Ibn Sina is taking us on. There must be a necessary existence that is external to the set of all contingent or possible existence. Something that, per definition, has to exist and couldn't possibly not exist. It is the uncaused cause of all things beyond time and space. And this necessary existent, the al-wajib al-wujud, is God. Quote, it has become clear that every chain organized of causes and effects, be it finite or infinite, is in need of a cause external to it, if it does not include anything save effects. It is necessary that this external cause be linked to it as an extremity. It has also become clear that if this chain includes an uncaused thing, then this thing is an extremity and a limit. Therefore, every chain terminates in that whose existence is necessary in itself. But this also makes certain things to be required for this necessary existence. It has to be beyond time and space, as we said, otherwise it would be bound by those things and thus contingent. It can't be made up of any parts, it must be simple and unified, a partless reality. Because like we said, if it was made up of parts, it would be dependent on those parts, thus caused by those parts, and suddenly it wouldn't be a necessary existent anymore. Quote, if the essence of that whose existence is necessary is composed of two or more things that unite, it becomes necessary by them. One of these things, or every one of them, will be prior to it and a constituent of it. Therefore, that whose existence is necessary is indivisible, whether in concept or in quantity. For the same reason, the necessary existent must be immaterial, incorporeal, so as to not be dependent on a body. It's also unlike anything in the world, not sharing in the quiddity or whatness of anything else in terms of genus or species. Remember that we said that the quiddity or essence of God is simply existence. Quote, the first has no alike, no contrary, no genus, and no difference. Thus it has no definition and cannot be indicated except by pure intellectual knowledge. In this way, Ibn Sina also takes this argument further by also attempting to prove that this necessary existent, or God, aligns with the theological tenets of the Islamic religion. Most importantly for this, perhaps, is that the necessary existent is one, thus affirming the basic Islamic principle of Tawheed, or monotheism. After all, why does there have to be only one necessary existent? Couldn't there be 2 or 3 or even 10? Well, let's suppose that there are 2 necessary beings. Because they are 2, there must be something that separates them. So within the reality of these 2, there must be some things that make them similar and thus necessary, but also other aspects that make them distinct from each other, otherwise they would be identical and not 2 different things. But if that is the case, then that means that they are made up of parts or aspects in which they are different from each other, and then they wouldn't be necessary anymore, but would be caused by those parts, and therefore both of them are now dependent on some other actually necessary existent. So this is obviously absurd. There must, in other words, be only one necessary existent, or God, who shares all the characteristics, or perhaps non-characteristics, that we have just outlined. So in a nutshell, that is Ibn Sina's proof or argument for the existence of God, an argument that has become very influential throughout history. Now, if you want a more proper rundown of this argument, you should definitely check out Dr. Khalil Andani's channel called Thinking Islam, where he presents this argument. He has a video dedicated to this argument with visuals and graphs that really help explain it in an even better way. So he breaks it down in a more detailed and I think in a better way than I do in that video. So go check that out if you're interested. Thus, Ibn Sina believes that he has proven that there is a necessary existent, and that necessary existent necessarily has certain features and qualities that align with the Islamic conception of God. Now, this isn't a very personal God, you might think, and a personal God that listens to and answers prayers seems kind of key to an Islamic theology. Well, Ibn Sina doesn't deny these factors, but his conception of God and the way that he reads the Quran is through this more philosophical framework, where God is the first principle of reality, which is one and from which everything comes, and of course upon which everything depends. He summarizes in the Book of Healing, quote, "It has become manifest to us that there is, for the whole, a principle whose existence is necessary, that is neither included in genus nor is subject to definition or demonstration, that he is free from quantity, quality, quiddity, place, time, and motion, that he has neither equal, companion, nor contrary, that he is one in all respects because he is not divisible, neither in terms of parts in actuality, nor in terms of parts by supposition and estimation as with the continuous, nor in the mind in that his essence is composed of varied intellectual ideas from which an aggregate becomes united, and that he is one inasmuch as he does not share at all with others the existence that belongs to him. He is thus by this unity single. He is one because he is perfect in existence, nothing in him awaits completion, this being one of the aspects of the One. But these features of God also have certain implications for his relationship with the world and its creation. Indeed, because the first principle is necessary, all aspects of it is necessary, including its creating or emanating creation. Since God is one, as in being perfect without need or completion, it seems wrong to Ibn Sina to say that God created the world at some specific point, because that would imply that God at some point hadn't created the world, and that would imply an imperfection in God that was then amended at some point by creation. If God didn't create and then later created, it means that there was a change in God, which is absurd with all of these previous definitions in mind. God is beyond time and space and remains complete and perfect always. So in other words, Ibn Sina argues that the creation of the cosmos is a necessary feature of God. God has to create, not because he is forced to, but because it is simply part of the nature of the necessary existent to create. That is what it does. And this also means that the universe is eternal. It has always existed rather than being created ex nihilo from nothing at some point. He says in the Kitab al-Shifa, quote, "After this it became evident to you that the existent necessary in himself is a necessary existent in all his aspects, and that it is impossible for a state which did not exist previously to commence for him. With this, it became evident to you that the cause in terms of itself necessitates the effect, so that if it is permanent, it necessitates the effect permanently." This became quite a controversial point to other Muslim thinkers, and is indeed another one of the three doctrines for which al-Ghazali deems Ibn Sina an unbeliever a century later. To him, and many others, it seemed to rob God of his role as creator. If he didn't choose to create or create at a specific point in time, that seems to put God and the universe on equal footing in some respects. But to Ibn Sina, this was the only logical conclusion based on the nature of God and the necessary existent. And it's also easy to misunderstand what he's saying here. He affirms, of course, that God is the ultimate cause of the world and that God is prior to the universe, but he's ontologically prior rather than temporally prior, as in coming before in terms of time, since God is beyond time and space and any such limits. God causes the world, but that cause is simultaneous with the effect. An example from the real world that he likes to employ here is a person that wants to unlock a door and puts the key in the lock. When he turns the key to unlock the door, his act of turning the key comes first, so to say. It is prior to the key itself turning, but at the same time, the man turning the key and the key itself turning happens at the same time, temporally. If I turn this microphone like this, my action of turning the microphone, technically, at least you could say, happens prior to the microphone itself moving. Because my muscles moving the microphone is the thing that causes that thing to happen. But at the same time, my moving the microphone and the microphone itself moving, so to say, my action and the movement of the microphone happens at the exact same time. Right, so this is the argument that he's making with God and the world. God is prior to the world. The world can still be eternal while still being caused by God and preceded by God, ontologically, but not temporally. They are both eternal, so to say. And the world is eternal because it is eternally created by God. And this is the metaphor, the simile that he uses, the key in the door, or in this case, which would be my simile, which would be this microphone moving in this way. And once the world is created, and Ibn Sina starts describing the process of creation itself in a cosmological way, we can also see how deeply he is indebted to earlier philosophical traditions, not just Aristotelianism, but especially in this case, Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism was a school of thought, a continuation of the teachings of Plato, or Platonism, that is often considered to have been founded by the 3rd century philosopher Plotinus. You can check out previous episodes, several ones that I made on Neoplatonism, for a deeper introduction to their general ideas. But one of the key ways in which we see Ibn Sina adopting Neoplatonic ideas is that he conceived of God as creating the world through emanation. The first principle necessarily emanates or flows over and thus creates things other than him, so to say. And as we go down the chain of being, we see that he, much like the Neoplatonist, adopts the idea of emanation from the first principle, or the necessary existent, through the mediation of intellect to the material world, as well as the possibility of an ascent or return back up the ladder to the One. According to Ibn Sina, from one there can only appear one. And so the first thing that originates or emanates from God is the numerically singular first intellect, similar to the position of the nous or intellect in Plotinus. This one intellect has a kind of multiplicity in it though, as it contemplates both itself and its source, God. So this leads to the fact that it creates another second intellect, as well as the body and form of a celestial sphere. So in Ibn Sina's system, unlike Plotinus, and more similar to his Islamic predecessor Al-Farabi, there follows 9 intellects in a descending order from the first intellect, all associated with a particular planetary sphere, and sometimes also identified with the angels of religious language in the Quran, for example. At the bottom, we reach the 10th intellect, also called the active intellect, or sometimes the agent intellect, which rules over and emanates the sublunary material world that we live in. Now keep in mind that to Ibn Sina, all of this is controlled by God, of course. It's not that these intellects have creative agency or powers in themselves per se. The active intellect doesn't create the material world. God creates the material world, but he does so through the active intellect. This active or agent intellect also has a very important role to play for the individual human soul and its capacity to know things, because our individual souls are always in contact with this active intellect, which is a key to how we can understand and know things in the world. So now we have very conveniently entered into Ibn Sina's ideas of epistemology and psychology. He has an interesting perspective here, and it can even seem like he is contradicting himself. On the one hand, like a good Aristotelian, Ibn Sina argues that we come to know things, concepts and universals, through empiricism. We experience particular things in the world, and then we can deduce universal concepts and abstract forms based on that knowledge. So if I see a cat, for instance, and then I see another cat and then another cat, eventually I'll be able to deduce that the universal concept of catness involves, for instance, having 4 legs. So this is the primary way that he thinks about epistemology, a down-up movement where we learn things through empirical experience and then conclude abstracts from that. But on the other hand, he also seems to say that we receive knowledge from the active intellect in some way, and different scholars have interpreted this in different ways. It seems to me to be an idea that we indeed receive knowledge by our direct experience of particular things in a sort of empirical way, but that knowledge is sort of confirmed in the active intellect with which we are in contact. So maybe we can think of it like we're playing a video game, for example. There is often in video games there's a map of the whole sort of world that you're playing in, and often when you start the game, that map is sort of veiled, or certain parts of the map is unavailable to you. You can't see it, so it might be clouded, or it might be just you can't see what's there yet. It is there technically, right, but you can't see it. So what happens is you have to walk around with your character in the game in this world, and when you discover new places, that place on the map will sort of unveil itself, right? So this is, I might be misunderstanding it, but this is the way that I'm kind of conceiving of this idea of the active intellect. That all that knowledge is available in the intellect, and we can sort of receive that knowledge, but we need to sort of unlock that knowledge empirically in this world first, like in a video game where we unveil parts of the world map. This has very conveniently taken us all the way down from the abstract metaphysics of the necessary being to the individual human soul, the topic of psychology, or in Arabic, ilm al-nafs, which literally means science of the soul. And Ibn Sina has some really fascinating things to say about this topic. Finally, we can now return to that thought experiment with which we started the video, the so-called floating man. This thought experiment had as its purpose to basically prove not only that the soul existed, but that it was non-bodily, that it was distinct from the body. Remember what we said. A fully functioning adult person pops into existence right now, floating in mid-air with arms and legs stretched out. He has no memory of previous experience, he can't see, he can't hear, smell, taste, or feel anything, not even his own body, since his limbs are stretched out so that no part touches the other. So the question then goes, Is he aware of his own existence? To Ibn Sina, the answer is clear. While he is not aware of any body or sense, the man is still aware of his own self. Self-awareness is fundamental, in other words, and precedes all other sensory or bodily experiences. Thus, there is a self or soul that is distinct from the body. Now, you may or may not accept this argument. Many have had counter-arguments against it, but the point to take from it is that Ibn Sina believed that there was such a soul and that it had this particular nature. To Ibn Sina, the soul is born when the body is born, but it survives after the body's demise. And although the two are clearly distinct in one sense, they also complement each other. The body is responsible for taking in information through the five senses, but the soul takes that information and abstracts knowledge using what Ibn Sina refers to as the five internal senses, which are common sense, the representational power, al-musawwira, and the imaginative or sensible memory, which is known as al-khayal. Then there is wahm, or estimation, can also be translated as instinct, and many other words. It's a difficult word in Arabic. Then there is cognition and memory, al-dhakira. All of these are employed in different ways to reach knowledge of abstracts and universals. Indeed, to Ibn Sina, an immaterial intellect can only know universals, not particulars, since particular things, such as a specific cat in the world rather than the concept of a cat, exists in the outside world of senses. So again, the body takes these sensible particulars, gives that information to the intellect, which derives universal knowledge from it. And this is a significant point, because this is also what leads Ibn Sina to another one of his most controversial points, and another one of those three that Al-Ghazali deemed equivalent to unbelief, namely that God only has knowledge of universals and not particulars. This follows pretty neatly from what we've just discussed. God is not a physical thing or a body with senses that is dependent on time and space. He is, if anything, an immaterial intellect that knows things through that intellect. But because immaterial intellects can never know particulars, this follows that God can only know universals. Or rather, he knows particulars, but in a universal way. I'm really not doing justice to his argument here, but essentially what he's saying here is that an intellect that knows the principle of all things, knows all things, including particulars, but he knows them in a universal and unified way. In the Shifa, he uses the example of eclipses. One can know all the movements of the celestial spheres in principle, and as such you would know all eclipses and what they are. But if that perfect intellect was to know particular eclipses that take place at a specific time, that would introduce difference in the divine intellect, which would be absurd. He says, quote, "If, however, you introduce time into this, whereby at a given time you know that that eclipse does not exist, and then at another time that it exists, then your former knowledge ceases when the eclipse exists, but a new knowledge comes to be. There will then be in you the change to which we have referred. And it would not be true that you are in the same state at the time of the clearing of the eclipse as you were before its clearing. This applies to you who are temporal and exist in moments of time. But the first, who does not enter time and its governance, is remote from making a judgment in terms of this time and that time by way of his being in it, and by way of this involving a new judgment on his part and a new knowledge. God, who is beyond time and space, doesn't experience particulars because that would entail that he knows things at one moment, but not the next moment when that thing isn't there anymore. And this would be absurd for God. In other words, God knows particulars only in a universal way. We've already gone on quite the journey here, from the metaphysics of the first principle of God to the individual soul in the world. And when a person has this knowledge of the world as it truly is, they can live up to their full potential. To live a philosophical life and seek truth and God means to turn away from our bodies and its many wants and needs, to focus our attention on the intellect and through that reach higher on our quest for illumination. Indeed, just like the Neoplatonists generally, Ibn Sina seems to include in his system an idea not just of the emanation of God downwards, but also the return back up the ladder of intellects and realities. In other words, there are certain aspects of Ibn Sina's thought that are quite mystical in nature. So the question then becomes, was Ibn Sina a mystic underneath all of the philosophical and logical rigor that he presents on the surface? Scholars greatly disagree on this topic. Many, like Peter Adamson, see this as a mistaken view of Ibn Sina, whereas others like Sayyid Hussein Nasr or the translator Shams Inati have argued more in the opposite direction. So let's explore this topic for a few minutes. It is no doubt that when we read the works of Ibn Sina, we are primarily met with a deeply philosophical mind, one that is concerned with logical deduction, syllogisms, and rigorous rational argument. This is the main thing that characterizes his output. But there are hints at something else, something that goes beyond the limits of the rational mind, or at least its expression in human language. Especially in his later writings, we see expressions and descriptions of a much more mystical character, even particularly that of Sufism. Indeed, it is said that Ibn Sina was in contact with the famous Persian Sufi Abu Sa'id al-Khair, but was he a mystic himself? As we saw in that last and perhaps most mature of his works, the Isharat wal Tanbihat, the last section is often called under the title Sufism. And indeed, the 9th class deals particularly with the, quote, station of the knowers. He never uses the word Sufism or Sufis himself, but when we read this section, it becomes clear that he's describing the mystical path of the knower, the word in Arabic here is arif, on the quest to conjunction and union with the truth. He begins by talking about the differences between knowers and non-knowers. Non-knowers perform acts of worship and sometimes even asceticism for transactionary reasons, in other words, to get rewards in the next life. But the knowers do these things for the sake of the truth itself. Quote, "The name knower is reserved for one who disposes one's thought toward the sanctity of the divine power, seeking the perpetual illumination of the light of the truth into one's innermost thought." He then basically describes a mystical journey through 9 different steps, from occasional moments of insight, awqat, to finally reaching the utmost heights of rapture and union with the truth. Quote, "The 8th step, if he crosses from spiritual exercise to attainment of the truth, his innermost thought will become a polished mirror with which he faces the side of the truth. The lofty pleasures are then poured on him, and he is pleased with himself due to the traces of the truth that these pleasures involve. To him belongs a glance at the truth and a glance at himself, for he is still reluctant. And then the 9th step, following this, he abandons himself. Thus he notices the side of sanctity only. If he notices his self, he does so inasmuch as it notices the truth, and not inasmuch as it is ornamented with the pleasures of having the truth. At this point, the arrival is real. One has reached the ultimate truth, a truth which becomes all-encompassing and in which all things share. To know this ultimate truth is to know all things, because all things take part in this one truth. This is a kind of unio mystica, a mystical union in other words, and the ultimate step on the path. It is the end of all knowledge and its confirmation. Shams Inati describes it thus, quote, "Salvation consists not of attaining knowledge of the truth, but of attaining the truth itself, the object of such knowledge. Or, truth captures all there is to know. This is to say that it captures all that exists as well, for the truth and the one, or being, are the same." This perhaps isn't that surprising. Many philosophers, including Plato, Plotinus, and others, conceive of a kind of mystical ascent to the source of truth or to the one. And Ibn Sina does have a slightly different language to talk about this than does many of the Sufis. Ibn Sina is very philosophical in his expressions, as you have probably noticed. The ascent is an ascent of the rational soul to the theoretical intellect, which can receive illumination from God. But the basic idea seems to be the same, and he thus shares in the Neoplatonic concept not only of procession out of the one, but the ability of the individual to return back to the one, to achieve union with the truth itself. But the question still remains, was Ibn Sina himself a mystic or a Sufi? These are clearly descriptions of a mystical journey to some kind of union, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he had these experiences himself. At the very least, we can say that he acknowledged the reality of the mystics and their experiences, and he described those experiences here. But what of his own personal involvement? I do think there are some clues to this in the text of the Isharat itself. Indeed, when he talks about the state of union, he states that there are steps and journeys even after this point of union, but then, very importantly, he says, quote, "We have preferred brevity concerning them, for conversation does not capture them. A phrase does not explicate them, and discourse does not reveal anything about them. No power responsive to language other than the imagination receives even a semblance of them. He who desires to know these steps must move gradually until he becomes one of the people of witnessing and not of speaking, one of those who arrive at truth itself and not those who hear the trace. In other words, the truths experienced by the mystic, especially those on the highest stations of union, cannot be put into words or described in any way. Instead, they can only be known by the person who experiences them firsthand. This seems to indicate that Ibn Sina had such experiences himself, but which he cannot express verbally in the text. And we can see further such indications in some of his lesser known and shorter works, such as the Risalat al-Tayr, or the Epistle of the Bird, which is a kind of mystical allegory about a bird captured by a snare that is able to escape this prison with the help of noble companions, and then they all go on a journey across 9 mountains, or 8 mountains, depending on how you count, and eventually meets the great and beautiful king. This allegory is most likely a poetic retelling of that same kind of mystical path that he describes in the Isharat. The snare being the world and the body, and the journey representing the path to union itself, along with companions that are needed on this path. I think it's also interesting that this story is very similar and reminiscent of the later, even more famous Conference of the Birds by Fariduddin Attar, although I haven't seen many people talk about the possible connections between these two stories. There is also the famous short story Hayy ibn Yaqzan, which also has a quite mystical character, and whose title, you probably heard this title about because it would inspire another even more famous work by the philosopher Ibn Tufayl, who wrote a very famous novel also called Hayy ibn Yaqzan, that was inspired by this original work by Ibn Sina that has definitely a kind of mystical character to it. So based on this evidence, it seems to many that Ibn Sina had a mystical side to him, at least later in his life, but that he often hides this underneath symbolic language, such as in the Epistle of the Bird, for instance, or through more difficult, obscure writings like in the Isharat. On the one hand, the reason why he didn't speak of these things could be because of what he stated in the Isharat, that it is simply beyond language and useless to try to put it into words. This is similar to what Rumi says in the beginning of the Masnavi, that he can't put what he is about to say into words, and then he spends 6 books talking about it anyway. Ibn Sina might be sort of restricting himself even more than Rumi did in this case by actually not saying that much about it. But it also might have something to do with his reputation as a rational philosopher, and to be too much involved with Sufism might have hurt his reputation among some of his kin, perhaps. Who knows? The jury is still out on whether or not Ibn Sina was actually a mystic himself or not. For my part, I certainly lean toward the idea that he seems to have had an interest in mysticism. He seems familiar with the concepts of mysticism, and even more so, I think I lean toward the idea that he might have had at least some kind of mystical experiences himself. This seems to be what I sort of glean from his writings, especially the section on Sufism in the Isharat, as well as like in the Risalat al-Tayr, for example. But, who knows? This might just be him writing about things that he had heard from other people. But this seems like a natural extension of his philosophy too, right? So to him, the philosophical path or the philosophical life is one of turning away from the body, right? Of focusing inwardly on the intellectual part of ourselves, right? And that journey of ascent in the sort of intellectual world has a natural limit, you could say. And after that kind of limit, it seems that Ibn Sina affirms this idea at least. You reach some sort of limit, and after that limit, the so-called mystical has to take over. And so when we read his philosophy, even his philosophy, right, the more rational aspect, he seems to allude to that idea. And it becomes especially clear, I think, in the Isharat, in the chapter on Sufism. Whatever the case, this is really a fascinating aspect of this very famous philosopher. He's known as one of the champions of rationalism and logic and reasoned philosophy. But it seems, just like in the case with Maimonides, that there might have been a mystical side to him. He might have been some kind of Sufi. We don't know, again, we don't know for sure, but to me the evidence seems to kind of point in that direction. And he did indeed talk about something he calls the Hikmat al-Mashriqiyya, or the Eastern philosophy, sometimes also translated as the Oriental philosophy. He even named one of his treatises after this phrase and saw himself as a representative of this Eastern wisdom. On the one hand, this Eastern philosophy seems to demarcate a difference between his own philosophy and those in the Eastern region in Greater Iran and Central Asia on the one hand, compared to the quote-unquote Western philosophy associated with the peripatetic school of Baghdad, whom he was critical of. But what made this Eastern philosophy different might be precisely this incorporation of mystical aspects and ideas into it. There's at least one way of looking at it. Many have also speculated that the slightly later As-Surawardi and his philosophy of illumination might have some direct connections with Ibn Sina's Eastern philosophy. As indeed, Hikmat al-Ishraq, the wisdom of illumination, and Hikmat al-Mashriqiyya is quite close etymologically, the word for east, mashriq, and illumination, ishraq, being strongly connected etymologically. We also see the 12th century Andalusian philosopher Ibn Tufayl talk at length about Ibn Sina's so-called Eastern philosophy in the aforementioned novel Hayy ibn Yaqzan, and basically states that this story is a fictional exploration precisely of this Eastern philosophy. And when we read this novel, it very much expresses themes that we find in Ibn Sina's Al-Isharat and, very importantly, also incorporates Sufism or mystical practice and experience as central to the attainment of philosophical truth and union. Whatever is the case with this particular topic, and it is one that scholars disagree on greatly still today, there is no doubt that Ibn Sina became one of the most, or perhaps the most, influential philosopher after this point in the history of the Islamic world and beyond. Whereas before, Aristotle was seen as the philosopher par excellence, after Ibn Sina, it was him that everyone basically turned to, including as authority on Aristotle. Islamic philosophy is indeed often divided into pre-Ibn Sina and post-Ibn Sina to highlight just how incredibly significant of an impact he had. And this is not just in the realm of falsafa or philosophy more narrowly defined. Ibn Sina's influence can be felt in some of the mainstream Islamic theology from that time onward as well. Even though many Sunni theologians, such as Al-Ghazali, were highly critical of Ibn Sina and the philosophers, at least over a certain point that he believed went against religion, at the same time, he and many others still employed certain other aspects, ideas, and arguments from Ibn Sina. As a very famous and clear example, we can just look at Fakhruddin al-Razi, who is considered one of the greatest and most significant theologians and scholars in the whole Sunni tradition. He wrote, among other things, a very famous and massive commentary on the Quran called the Mafatih al-Ghaib, or the Keys to the Hidden, that has become one of the standard works of Quran tafsir, especially in the Ash'ari school that he belonged to. But he also wrote a commentary on the Isharat wal-Tanbihat by Ibn Sina. And even though he's very critical of many of Ibn Sina's ideas and conclusions, we can see that he also takes inspiration from him in many of his own formulations, including in his Quran commentary. So although controversial in some circles, Ibn Sina had a direct and indirect impact on mainstream Sunni and Shia theology. The scholar Robert Wisnowski wrote, quote, "Before Avicenna, Falsafa and Kalam, Islamic doctrinal philosophy or theology, were distinct strands of thought, even though of course a good deal of cross-fertilization took place between them. After Avicenna, by contrast, the two strands fused together, and post-Avicennan Kalam emerged as a truly Islamic philosophy, a synthesis of Avicenna's metaphysics and Muslim doctrine. And in the realm of Sufism, the same is true. Regardless of Ibn Sina's own status as a mystic or not, there is no doubt that the philosophical mystics like Ibn Arabi and his Akbari school took things from Ibn Sina, including his distinction between essence and existence, and used them as key aspects of their own thoughts and systems. But as we said, his influence isn't limited to the Islamic world either. His works were translated into Latin and would come to influence the birth of scholasticism in Europe, thus playing a major role in the later developments there indirectly, such as even things like the Renaissance. Some of the great Christian theologians like Thomas Aquinas clearly took a few notes from Ibn Sina's works, and the former's own argument for God's existence seems to borrow quite directly from the proof of the truthful, for instance. We also saw that Ibn Sina's great work on medicine, the Canon of medicine, became one of the main sources for medicine even in Europe, and remained so until the early modern period with the birth of modern medicine. And in this episode, we have really only been able to tackle a few samples of the massive beast that is his thought. There is so much that we could have brought up too, and ways in which his philosophical insights interest us historically. For example, in his work on physics, Ibn Sina basically presents an idea of motion, that an object in motion will remain in motion unless acted upon by an outside force, which is basically identical to Isaac Newton's first law of motion, but 6 centuries before Newton himself. And there's much other stuff similar to this. He was really ahead of his time in many different ways. In conclusion, there is no doubt that Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, is one of the most important, one of the most brilliant philosophical minds, not just in the history of the Islamic world, but in the history of the world generally. His massive output is impressive in itself, but the ideas that he presents and how much those ideas were influential in later Islamic philosophy, as well as spreading all the way to Europe and being very significant for the development of scholasticism, his influence on the medical practices in Europe for centuries after. He truly is one of the greatest luminaries in at least in philosophy and science in all of history. So it becomes obvious that his assigned title of Sheikh al-Ra'is is kind of accurate. It certainly has something to it. Sadly, in 1037, Ibn Sina fell greatly ill while traveling with his patron Ala ad-Dawla. He had been suffering from colic for much of his life, and it eventually caught up with him. He passed away that year in Hamadan at only about 57 years old, and his tomb remains in the city of Hamadan to this day. It's always sad when a genius like him passes away at such a relatively young age, and we can marvel and think about what he might have accomplished if he had lived longer. But at the same time, it is thought that Ibn Sina himself once said, quote, "I prefer a short life with width to a narrow one with length." And if anything, it certainly seems like he achieved that goal. Thank you all so much for watching. I want to thank my patrons for supporting this channel and for keeping all of this running monetarily. None of this would be possible without you, so I always want to make sure that I thank you properly at the end of each video. Thank you so much. I really can't thank you enough. I would highly appreciate if anyone else wanted to support this channel. You can do that on Patreon with a monthly donation. You can find links to that in the description. You can also support the channel through a one-time donation on PayPal, or, it's always helpful if you just like, subscribe to the channel, or leave a comment and keep the discussion going there too. If you're interested in my work, either with religious studies or music, you can find me on my socials. I have Instagram and TikTok and all that stuff, and I post exclusive content that I don't post here sometimes, so check that out. I also have another channel that is specifically dedicated to my music and music content similar to what I do here. It's called Philip Holm. You can find it also in, I'll link all this stuff in the description, probably in my link tree. So follow that link and find all of that stuff there. Thank you again so much for watching. I hope that this video has inspired you in some way. I think given the topic, it's strange if it wouldn't inspire you, because Ibn Sina is such a fascinating and important figure in history. Look forward to more content like this in the future, where we can cover more similar figures from history and from different religious traditions and philosophical schools. So again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.